Hi, I'm Celia Hatton, and welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube, where we go behind the headlines. Today, we're looking at the fallout from Donald Trump's latest trade tariffs. Last year, he laid sweeping levies on dozens of countries. But in the last few days, they were struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. President Trump responded with, guess what, new tariffs. So what does this mean for the future of global trade? That's a question for our BBC economics editor, Faisal Islam. Faisal, I want to get to the global reaction to these tariffs in a moment. But first, let's talk about what's going on inside the US. We're hearing words like chaos and rollercoaster a lot at the moment.
Yeah, and actually you can't separate these two things out. I think that's the lesson. Obviously, understandably, people are sort of wait for what comes down from the White House via social media, via proclamations. In this case, the chaos and the roller coaster, I mean, this is just a microcosm of it, but we had thought that the 15% tariff was going to apply immediately. That was what was announced on Saturday, although that was an increase from Friday, which was 10%, which was obviously a replacement for the Supreme Court knocking down the previous version of these tariffs. And indeed, let me let you into a little secret as to the BBC. I wrote a radio report saying 15% has just come in, went to bed, woke up, and lo and behold, it was 10% unexpectedly in terms of the formal notice that came out of the US Customs Department. And so that was quite interesting. So again, you're sort of, there was some relief else around the world where people thought they were going to be hit, but also just general, like, okay, how long is this going to last now? And then you have this delicate game of, is it 3D chess or 4D chess? And I can never quite get it right, about, well, what are you playing now? It was quite clear, that Donald Trump, unusually over the past 12 months, sort of assumed control over this tariff weapon, as it were, using it as a weapon, using it as a form of diplomacy, using it as a form, as a bludgeon to change the US economy, to create more factories and jobs. But he's not in control anymore. He is not, as one of my, a British business figure put it, he's not emperor of tariffs anymore. So there was a strategy. We should, explain that the president, and it's a thought-through strategy, thinks that globalization went too far. Most of the rest of the world thinks that the US benefited hugely from globalization, the era of Nike and McDonald's, those brands, cheap labor in factories, frankly, in East Asia,
World's
making
biggest economy,
and the world's biggest economy, and it did pretty well out of the era. But of course, the fruits of that win were not equally distributed in places like the Rust Belt. And so if you're concerned with that, and those areas voted for Donald Trump, and you want to return the factories, you can see the logic behind tariffing imports and saying that you're going to build those factories in the US instead. You can see it. That's the argument. Now, if the tariffs are like 140% one month, 100% the next, then 30%, then 10%, then 15%, then 10%, then they only last for 150 days. And then at the end of the 150 days, it's up to Congress, really, to decide whether they get extended, whatever the rate eventually is. That is just the most extraordinary uncertainty one can imagine. But it's extraordinary that at the end result of the past 4 days' chaos is the Chinese just chomping their popcorn, benefiting from a 10% rate, which is far lower than the 140, the penal rate we were talking about 7 or 8 months ago. And yet at the same time, sort of gently, as they were at the World Economic Forum last month, saying to the rest of the world, enjoy your chaos with the USA. We'll defend the multilateral rules-based trade system. We're your stable partner here, which is what they do.
How are other economies trying to cope with this? You mentioned China.
Well, I think that they were playing this for the past 7-8 months because it was always questionable that the president had the executive power to do what he did. I talked about Congress assuming control in 6 months' time in terms of extension of what are now called Section 122 tariffs. These are the things that have just come in today to replace the Supreme Court tariffs. Now, that is actually just the... It's a return to what was normal. Normally, it's Congress that controls trade and tariffs, and that is a long-held constitutional position. So that is why the president lost the Supreme Court case. The politics that go around that more traditional setting of trying to persuade Congress is very different to trying to, if you like, impress one person. The European Union, for example, were past masters at identifying those pain points politically in Congress. All of that suddenly becomes very real again. you're then butting up against consideration in the US of the midterms, the popularity in general of these domestically. My understanding is in polling terms, they're not very popular. It certainly wasn't very popular, the threat to Europe to use tariffs over the Greenland issue, for example. And I heard that very clearly from, Republican senator who I spoke to, Tom Tillis, leading Republican senator, openly calling out the lack of popularity of his administration's trade strategy. So you asked me very, very correctly, well, let's do the US response, let's do the European response. I think one of the lessons of the past year is we pay an awful lot of attention, obviously, to what happens out of the White House. But the reaction, what an economist would call the reaction function of the rest of the world, really matters. And I'm taken back, actually, to that Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister's speech at Davos, where he talks about middle powers, and he talks about middle powers trying to deal with hegemons, so big powers in the world, the two big powers, essentially, China and the US. But he was saying, if you all deal individually, you have to have quite a sycophantic relationship. You're sort of dancing around trying to impress one person. If you act together calmly, you diversify, you trade with each other, then there are other possibilities available. And I think that's what you're seeing now. You're seeing the rest of the world will be thinking, actually, we managed to trade with each other quite a lot. The net result of everything we've seen, the chaos we've seen over the past 4 or 5 days, is that the average tariff rate is now lower. Unbelievably, the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians, who were, being hit with hard tariffs, are the great beneficiaries of the past few days, and it starts to look quite different.
So, are we seeing a real shift then? Are we seeing countries outside of the United States really essentially get a little bit fed up with having to worry about what's happening in the midterms, worry about what's happening in 150 days when Congress has to vote on the latest round of tariffs, and think, actually, maybe our smarter strategy is to forge ties with other economies. Maybe that's the more stable path. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think it's both of those things. And so you've seen, for example, the Canadians, they have more than made up for the loss in exports to the US, which is obviously by far and away the biggest trading partner. But the loss has been more than made up for by increased exports elsewhere. You're seeing a slew of trade deals for UK, India, EU, India, Latin America. There's a big plan to forge together the European Union with the CPTPP, the Pacific Trade Bloc that happens to include the UK. So there's that going on, which is just a sensible strategy when you can't really trust what's going on necessarily. But then you sort of think, well, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with sort of imperial power, essentially, sort of a single person having, just with the stroke of a pen, being able to apply a trade policy. Well, no, now it's one that's checked and balanced by the courts and by Congress.
What about those big trade deals that the US was in the process of negotiating? What now?
It seems like the US Trade Representative, and I would imagine people like the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, want to keep on to the wins there. But some of them have not been nailed down. But there's a bigger canvas here, which is I was in the room in the US Treasury when I heard Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer, the Treasury Secretary and Trade Representative, say to the rest of the world, basically, it's the world against China, and you're with us, aren't you? Aren't you? Aren't you? No. Well, and the rest of the world was like, well, if you want that, why are you starting a trade war with us? So what are they trying to achieve? Is he trying to raise? We still don't really. Is he trying to raise money to abolish some sort of federal income tax? Is he really trying to move jobs in factories? Is this about China? And depending on where you go on that view, you'll get a different response. So, yes, that trade deal process is still happening. It still counts for something, but it's being tested.
So, Faisal, you're a person who spends a lot of your time speaking with people around the world, politicians, economists, business people. I wonder what your sense is of this shift, away from trade with the United States. Is this a temporary thing, or is this a more permanent shift, do you think?
Well, I think a lot depends on what China does and China's approach to this situation, because I think what's happened is China has, again, I was at an international meeting and a Chinese businesswoman turned around and said, we understand you a lot more than you understand us, to privately. And I think they have been watching what's happening with America. They take things very patiently. And they think, well, this is an opportunity to show that we can be a good partner. Now, if they're also planning to invade Taiwan and do other things and, I don't know, help evade some sanctions with Russia and, help prolong the Russia-Ukraine war, that's not going to go down so well. But at the minute, they're playing a hand which is attempting to make the case, at least to some parts of the West, that they can be a stabilising influence. And the wink here is unlike what you're seeing from the US right now. And I don't think these things have to be absolute. So you have a China that might be a slightly more stabilising force than you would imagine, and you have the US being a less stabilising force. And so you have a sort of tilt. Now, this is a full-on rebalancing. Again, Prime Minister Carney going to China was quite interesting. Just look at the list of the world leaders that have turned up in Beijing in the past 6 weeks. Is that if the aim of all of this really was to counteract China, would success look like half the G7 turning up in Beijing, signing deals at lower tariffs?
Faisal, thank you. The BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam. Well, if you liked this episode, please do subscribe to us here on YouTube. And if there's a story you want us to cover, leave a comment below. If you want to hear more international news, you can also hear us on the Global News Podcasts. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Bye-bye.